Good evening. My name is Elian Ramos. Welcome to the Hangout tonight. And tonight is a very special night. We're celebrating Women's Equality Day. In 1920, women were finally granted the right to vote, which was a huge step in the fight for equality. And but still, 94 years later, we're still fighting for equal pay for equal work. We're still fighting for the right to choose and access to birth control. We still are invisible virtually in corporate leadership, in the government, and in elected office. And worst of all, we are still fighting as to whether or not the fight for inequality is even worth fighting. So that's what makes it even worse. And I'm just talking about women in general. When you go and think about how Latinas and other women of color, their fight for equality is doubly complicated, because we not only have to fight against the mainstream stereotypes and the way that we are perceived and the way that we are treated, but we also have to fight internally with our own community. And so to talk about this, to explore how far we have come in the fight for equality, and to explore what women's equality means for women of color. I have a couple of my great friends here. I'm going to start with Kimberly. Kimberly Inez McGuire, who is the Director of Public Affairs at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. How are you, Kimberly? Welcome.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
And next time I have Veronica Arreola, who you probably recognize from Viva la Feminista. It's one of the pioneering blogs online about feminism. But Veronica is also the director for Women in Science and Engineering program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. How are you, Veronica?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. We are going to be joined in a little bit by Ann Marquez, who is the president for the National Hispana Leadership Institute. And she's a powerhouse woman, and she is going to be joining us in a little bit. So let's start the conversation with the two of you, you amazing women. Can we talk a little bit about a little background? Give me an overview of where you see Latinas in terms of equality. Where are we in the equality spectrum?
So I can start here. You know, I think there are many ways in which Latinas have been fighting for our rights. We've been fighting for our communities, but there are many ways in which we're still falling behind. I think one of the most concerning ways in which Latinas don't yet have equality is in terms of the wage gap. You know, you'll hear a lot of talk about how many cents on the dollar women make for men, but the reality is Latinas actually make the lowest amount than any other ethnic group of women when it comes to the wage gap. So that's a huge problem. I think one upside is that in terms of political participation, Latinas have absolutely been expanding. We don't have equality yet, but we're definitely getting closer. We know that a majority of the Latino voters are actually women. They're Latinas. Unfortunately, we're still only about 1% of elected officials. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Veronica?
Yeah, I would jump on that kind of very optimistic bandwagon there that was just framed. We're growing, we're expanding, we're really reaching out. I was just looking at some stats last night on Latinas, and we are growing in terms of those of us who are earning college degrees, finishing high school, opening small businesses. It's really like, it's amazing to see, because it's almost like we were cooped in like a really tiny tin, and somebody opened it up and we're springing out.
That's a great metaphor for it. That's exactly what's going on. So go ahead.
No, I mean, so I see that, you know, we are a long ways from any sort of equality in the society at large. But we're getting there. We definitely need to talk more about the wage gap and how pitiful it really is in terms of Latinas versus, you know, a man's dollar out there. And it's super important for women of color to know what their real wage gap is, because so many of us are having households, and so many of us are definitely more into income families.
I have some of the numbers here. It says that for Latinas is, whereas a woman, regular, Caucasian, I'm gonna say Caucasian woman makes only 77% of what the average working man makes. For Latinas, it is 59 cents out of every dollar. So it's we are really below the, it's almost half actually of what a man makes. So we have a lot of road to make up here. Like, what do you think are the barriers? Because it seems to me like the barriers are not just external, but there's also internal barriers that are kind of hindering us. And Veronica just said that we are kind of exploring, getting out there, but we are not quite there yet. And so what is it that is holding us back? What do you think?
Well, some of the things that is missing from the wage gap discussion, as well as the idea of like 77 cents to a dollar or 55 cents to a dollar, is that that's overall. So women as a whole are segregated into the most low-paying jobs. And so then Latinas are also thus even further segregated into those jobs. We're more likely to be temporary workers, caregivers, nannies, and home care health workers. So we are, as a community, as a segment, are really in those low-paying jobs. So in order to close that gap, we not only have to work on institutional sexism and racism, but getting our daughters to actually go after those more high-paying jobs, and as well as working on valuing caregiving. So we're not paying caregivers $10 an hour to take care of our abuelitas and niñas.
Very true, very true. I'm showing now, this is a chart from the Center for American Progress that kind of depicts what unequal pay is for Black and Latina women. It's a little bit tiny on the screen. I hope that you guys can see it, but I'm going to be posting this online as well on my blog so that you can see it with more. But it's basically what we're talking about here. We are so behind that, things like poverty hit us a lot harder. More of us live in poverty. There are more single breadwinners who are taking care of their families on their own, and we're disproportionately unemployed. And so all of those things come into play when it comes to having a living wage and to having the means to live in equality. So let's talk about another aspect of this. And Veronica, we were talking about this before the show started. It's the insane way in which we are depicted out there by the media. And I think that influences so much our ability to move up in so many ways. And judging by the contradictory images that there are for women of color. I mean, we are either the scheming bumps, like the mamacitas, so to speak, or we are the financially stable and the socially mobile Latinas. You know what I mean? So those things don't seem to make sense when you think of one and the other. How can we be making progress in the all boys network when we are still tied to these stereotypes? So in your opinion, which one of these depictions is true, and how do these depictions help to perpetuate the inequality for Latinas?
Well, there's a saying that says stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason. So somebody has embodied them in the past. The problem with stereotypes is that we continue to feed them. So we feed them through vampy, sex pot, ditzy Latina caricatures that are on TV and movies, and that paints the danger in that is that it paints a public picture of what a Latina is, who a Latina is. What are her schemes? What are her dreams? Is she really looking to marry into an older white man's marriage? Or is she does she want to have her own business? Does she want to stand on her own 2 feet? Those sorts of things. So that's why images in the media are so important, because it paints our idea of who we think is walking towards us on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and certainly we have, you guys may have been referring to this, but we have an example of that with, just the recent Emmys where, you have Sofia Vergara.
That's exactly what we were talking about.
I thought so.
Yeah.
But, you have Sofia Vergara. She is an incredibly accomplished actress. She has an incredible career. She's been a part of this, hugely successful show. And, the mannerisms of her character aside, the reality is that she's in a place where they're celebrating people who've been successful in television. She's been a successful businesswoman and a successful actress, and we saw in this depiction of her, she was reduced to her body parts. Mm-hmm. And frankly, and it's insulting to her, it's insulting to all Latinas, and we see this again and again, where especially with Latinas, we're often reduced to our sexuality, right? Yes. So when you talk about the myths and the mythology, at the same time, we sort of hear this, some have referred to it as like the virgin whore dichotomy, right? That, that there's no room for complex or nuanced expressions of female sexuality, certainly not Latina sexuality, right? Yeah. If you have to put us into one of these 2 boxes. So I think a great example of that is, when we think about what are the images that young people are facing about Latinas and sexuality, they need to see more positive images about, a healthy celebration of sexuality that doesn't reduce us to a stereotype.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. I had a conversation about Latinos in the media, Latinos in general, but this came up, obviously, yesterday's award show kind of added fuel to the fire. But just like that, that also happens in our own media, in Latino media, where the women are hypersexualized. It also happens in the case, for example, of Beyonce, who presents herself as a hypersexualized woman, even though she is probably one of the most powerful entertainers in the world right now. So it's this kind of thing, I in my opinion, just kind of hinder all of the progress that we have, the little progress that we have done along the way. And I think for our children, I have a daughter. For our children, it's really a bad example to put in front, of our daughters, especially. It's not to say that you cannot use your sexuality, you cannot be like a feminine woman if you choose to be, but that doesn't go with the whole idea of success the way that it should be. So speaking of this and continuing with the thread of entertainment, we had Beyonce on Sunday, who was proudly proclaiming that she's a feminist. And I don't know about you, but I have a lot of women that I know who say that they're not feminists. They don't believe in it. They don't, no, that's not who I am. So where do Latinas fit within the feminist movement? Do you think that the movement has addressed our specific needs? There's a lot of conversations around this online, so I would love to hear what you guys think about it.
Well, this past week, there was really a really good example. So maybe Kimberly can add to this, but there was a movement to work on an issue. There was movement by the White House to address the birth control issue. Mm-hmm. And one day, maybe in the morning, I got a press release from a very mainstream, what people consider a white feminist organization, saying they were appalled by the president's movement. But then by the afternoon, I got an email from NHLI saying that it was a positive movement. And I think that is where we need to realize that there is not one feminist movement. And Latina feminists have been a very strong movement throughout the history of feminism. We just may not always get the recognition that other feminist organizations and other feminists do get.
So, but that's very interesting. What do you mean by there are more than one feminist movement? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a quote mainstream feminist movement that's embodied by organizations like Now and websites that take a more liberal feminist movement idea, and so they are looking at reproductive rights and they're not doing a very good job at intersectionality. Let's put it that way. They're looking at today's Women's Equality Day, for example. So 94 years ago, women got the right to vote. We were written into the Constitution finally. But for black women, they don't feel like they got the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So for many black women, they don't recognize this day as Equality Day. It's White Women's Equality Day. And as Latinas, we embody this weird middle ground between white feminism and black feminism in terms of rights, because for many of us, we've been able to pass as white. Or in our country's history, Latinos have been thought of as white because we weren't black. It was just simply that it was black or not black. So we were able to gain some, I don't see it as a rights, but acceptance and passability and tolerance because we weren't black in some ways. And then there have been moments, definitely moments, and it's regional as well, where we were seen as the opposition. So in that sense. So Latina feminism has definitely been very strong throughout. As I said, we just aren't at the top of the reading list.
Kimberly?
And, I think one of the most important things we can do is to reflect on our history. I'm so glad, Veronica, that you brought up, this complex history around Women's Equality Day, because often when something like women's equality is talked about, it may or may not be acknowledging or including black women, Latina women, API women, right? So I think we always want to be really careful about whose history we're invoking. But when I think about what kind of examples do we want to be setting out there for young Latinas to see the whole world of possibilities before them, I think about someone like Dolores Huerta, right? Who was an absolute partner with Cesar Chavez, did amazing labor organizing, has always been fighting for women's rights as well. Now, interestingly, though maybe not surprisingly, her story isn't told as often, right? There's no Dolores Huerta movie, though maybe there should be.
Yeah.
So, I think similarly, when we look at the women's movement of today, I completely agree, Veronica, that there are multiple sort of faces of feminism. And it's not a secret that groups like, maybe National Organization for Women or Planned Parenthood Federation of America are often put forward as kind of the face of the women's movement. And so I think a lot of the work that we're doing at National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health is to lift up the voices of Latinas who've been doing this work for a long time, but I think, Veronica, as you pointed out, it's not always visible, right? So, not everyone, not everyone's heard of organizations like, for example, Young Women United in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. I mean, these are groups that are working every day for women's rights and women's equality, and I think that a lot more young Latinas would identify as feminists or identify with feminism if they knew about some of the great work that Latina leaders are doing today.
Exactly.
At the same time, though, I see that a lot of, especially younger women, there's kind of like two segments, no? Because there are other young women that don't necessarily identify with feminism, even older women, even women that I know that say, oh, no, I can't be a feminist. I'm not a feminist. And so why do you think there is a disconnect for so many of our women in terms of identifying themselves as a feminist?
Oh, go ahead, Kimberly.
I'll answer the question in terms of millennials specifically, and Veronica, maybe you can be more expansive. I am one of those millennials that you've heard so much about on TV. And when we talk about millennials of any race, the reality is that we are a generation that does not embrace boxes and labels, right? So we see this. This is a really great example of this is within the LGBTQ movement. There are millennials who identify as bisexual, as pansexual, as queer, all along a spectrum, and who don't like labels at all. So I think there's a thread of that that's going to apply to any situation where there's this distrust of labels, this sense of, I'm going to chart my own path. And so I think, as when I look at the organizing work that we're trying to do, I mean, I personally identify as a feminist. That's an important identity to me. Mm-hmm. But I'm more interested in, even if they don't identify as feminists, if they're willing to do the work and fight for, our rights and our health, then they can call themselves whatever they like as long as we're in the fight together.
Exactly. What's in the name, right?
Exactly.
I often feel that way as well. My only caveat is that when you disengage the name, the label from the movement, from the actions, we lose part of our history. Mm. At least that's my opinion, what I think. And historically, we've been on this campaign for 30 years of a hugely successful media campaign to paint feminism and feminists as bad people, as man-haters. I mean, it's amazing that we're in 2014 and we can still hear things that were said in the 1980s about feminism, in the 1970s about feminism, that are stereotypes, that are falsehoods, that are lies, but that's how people see feminism. And so a part of that is teaching our history. Today I did some orientation with my peer mentors, and I started off by talking about Title IX and the fact that before 1972, most of them wouldn't have aspirations to go to medical school, to go to graduate school, because there would only be 2 seats for women in those kinds of situations. And if they think a competition is tough now, can you imagine in 1970 trying to be the 2 women who get into Harvard Med? It would be exhausting and impossible. But today, thanks to a feminist movement who has opened some doors, a lot of doors, they have many more choices. But interestingly enough, I will have to admit to say I said that whole thing without uttering the F word at all. So that's how I do it as well.
Yeah, and I think, I think for in my case, I think it's up to us who are leading the next generation. In my case, I have a daughter, like I mentioned, and one of the first books I gave my daughter, as a teenager, was the Esta Puente Mi Espalda, the Cherry Moriaga, and so teaching our kids, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and all of this rich history that we have as Latinas within the movement, that it's a whole different experience from mainstream feminism, so to speak. But that is something that maybe our younger kids can identify with because they can see themselves in it. So that's another way also that we can move towards that. I wanna speak in terms of, and we already established that this is not a Latino holiday or a women of color holiday, but I do want to talk about political power for Latinas. I had a hangout a couple of months ago about these, some very powerful Latinas. But where do you see Latinas in terms of political power? Are we engaged? What impact do you think we're going to have in the coming elections?
So I would say in terms of our impact on the election, I mean, that's been proven. Actually one of, I think, the most important lessons of, for example, the 2008-2012 elections is that this so-called women's vote, and I'm going to put quotes around it, but you'll hear about this women's vote that helps keep, for example, pro-choice candidates in office. The reality is that, for example, in the 2012 presidential election, a majority of white women voted for Mitt Romney. The only reason that they can even say that there is a women's vote that supported, for example, President Obama is because women of color, black women, Latina women, and API women voted so strongly for President Barack Obama and other kind of pro-choice, pro-women candidates, that they were able to win the election. So to me, the lesson there is this women's vote is being driven by women of color. A majority of Latino voters were women in the last election, and we're going to see that continuing to happen. So we are already voting. I think the next step is we need to be recognized as a political force. You know, you hear about the women's vote, you hear about the Latino vote. I want to hear about the Latina vote.
Or we could just start talking about it as the women of color vote. I mean,
absolutely.
All get together and grab it.
Yeah, and in terms of being in office, I mean, in part of the conversation I had the last time was about how we're not necessarily represented in office, and I have a chart that I want to share before we go as well. This is from the NHLA, and it's talking about how no Latina has ever been part of the Senate. I hope you guys can see it. I know it's very small, but and there's only 5 Latinas out of 75 women who are in the statewide executive positions, and and so on and so forth. We are such a tiny, little, almost imperceptible part of the people who are in power, and yet we continue being presented as this force of nature in terms of our purchasing power and all of this. So it's almost like taking away the power that we can potentially have and putting it into like, oh no, just go out and shop. To me, that's
yes.
What do you
I'm
think
tired
about that?
About purchasing power. I am also exhausted. I'm tired of hearing about our purchasing power. I want to talk about our voting power and our political power, which can go hand in hand, definitely. I think, again, we need to think about the fact that historically women have entered the political arena after children are older. And so if Latinas are also doing that, we didn't enter the political arena as early as white women did, or a lot of different factors for that. So hopefully we will also take this cue from from our white sisters to enter the political arena earlier when our children are still younger. I have a lot of hope, especially with people like Lucy Flores on the scene, to inspire younger Latinas to just get out there and run for something.
Yes. Kimberly?
I agree completely that I also want to hear more about our voting power and our power as elected representatives. I think Lucy Flores is a great example of someone who not only has been a fierce Latina, but who's also out openly spoken about women's health. She told the story of her own experience with ending a pregnancy. I mean, so brave in telling her personal story. So I think a lot of what we need to be doing is thinking about how are we showing younger Latinas these examples, showing that you too can be poderosa, you too can have a position of power and serve your community, and we have to start very young. I think about when Sonia Sotomayor was brought onto the Supreme Court, and I was having conversations with little cousins and little family members and saying look, she's Puerto Rican, she's one of us and she's on the Supreme Court. You could do that too. So I think we need to tell these stories. We need to tell young people, there's not enough of us now, but, for every Latina who's running for her high school, student body president, and then maybe goes to the school board, maybe she's the one that's going to end up in the Senate. So I think building that pipeline of leadership is so crucial.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree that after Justice Sotomayor came on the scene, and then her memoir came out. My husband took our daughter to go see her at the library when she was
so great.
And they ended up in this. There was just too many people, so they couldn't be in the actual room. So they were in this overflow room watching her on a video. But Justice Sotomayor took the time to come and say hi to the overflow room. So my husband and daughter actually got to meet her, and because this is how an amazing woman this is on the Supreme Court. And so, and you know, one of the aspirations my daughter's had for the last couple of years is to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So,
Wow.
any dream, anything that if she shoots for that and she goes a little lower, she's still going to be an amazing Latina.
And that thanks to women like these, we can actually aspire to more. You know, it's I think it's so crucial, like you guys are saying, to show our Latinas these kind of examples, and also to show them the things that make us similar to other to other groups of people who are not Latino. You know, I think we tend to also sometimes to keep ourselves in our own little worlds, where it's so easy to if not necessarily we doing the reach out first, but at least like understanding our basic common humanity, right? So, in speaking of that, and I want to talk to Kimberly about this because I know the work that the National Latina Institute does in terms of reaching out to other groups and building coalitions about women's issues and Latina issues. Do you feel that in general, beyond your organization, that we are really, as women, taking advantage of all of these intersectionalities that we've been talking about? If not, how can we move to a place where we can start building coalitions and maybe stop the movement from being, you know, this is the white feminism or this is the Latina feminism, or you know, how do we bridge that gap there?
Absolutely. So I think one of the most important things we can do is to think about something like, for example, access to healthcare as a basic human right. Right. So while we understand that healthcare in this country has been denied on the basis of income, on the basis of immigration status, on the basis of gender, the reality is that every single person should be able to get the access to the healthcare they need. And so I think we've really been embracing a human rights framework and human rights understanding as a way to build solidarity across communities. So, for example, when we were early this spring, when the last couple of abortion clinics were closing in the Rio Grande Valley and in other areas of South Texas, the communities most affected were Black women and Latina women. And in that moment, you know, yes, we could recognize the impact on our community, but we also saw it in the context of the impact on women of color across the region, the impact on low-income women of any race across the region, right? The impact on rural women. So I think when we start to also expand and think about not only race, but are we thinking about class, because there are low-income women of all races? Are we thinking about, you know, something like LGBTQ identity where we can build solidarity? So I think the more we incorporate all of our complex identities, the more common humanity and common sense of basic human rights we find with everybody else.
Very true. Very true. Veronica, I know you have things to say about this.
You know, I like I'm a coalition builder. I like to put people together and connect people because I think that we all have a similar mission. We may have a little bit of tangents, or not tangents, but just like different flares of an issue, but ultimately we're all working for the same kind of social justice ending that we would like to live in, world we'd like to live in. So healthcare based on immigration may be more of a Latina issue, but healthcare based on access to jobs may impact our African American women more. I don't know. It depends. You know, it's a regional thing as well. So trying to focus on the big picture while also acknowledging our different communities' issues as well.
Mm-hmm. And the different kind of nuances, to our identity. We're not just like one thing. I mean, just look at the three of us, for example. You know, we are such a vast variety of people who claim to be Latino, who can claim to be Latino, and you know, and it has to do with the countries of origin, the skin color, everything about us is multifaceted. So it's just recognizing the fact that we don't have to be identical to be able to push in the same direction, right?
Yeah.
So I think that Anne won't be able to join us by now because it's already 7:36 and she hasn't been able to come in. She was flying, so it's probably a little hard for her.
to get into the show. But I want to, before we leave, to talk about a call to action. I always like to leave with a positive thing that is actionable that our people can do, whoever is viewing the show. So what can we do to guide our young women? That's one question, so that they can aspire to equality. But also, what is the one thing that you would tell our viewers tonight that they can do to help the fight for equality for Latina women?
Veronica, do you want to start?
I'm thinking hard on this one, and I've been thinking about it. I think that the best thing for people to do is really to get educated. So pick a website, pick a organization that works on behalf of Latinas, with Latinas, and learn a little bit about them. Here in Chicago, we have an organization called Mujeres, Latinas en Acción, and they have been working here since like the 1970s, if not longer. I forget exactly how long, but they put out these reports every year for the last maybe 15, 20 years on the status of Latinas in X. So domestic violence, reproductive health, those sorts of things. And so those are really good nuggets of information, and it's not a full book, it's not a doctoral thesis, it's not a boring academic paper. As an academic, I can say that. But it's just accessible to understand that what our wage gap is, how violence impacts our communities in that nuanced manner. So, just take a step out and reach out and learn a little bit of something. If you have a daughter like mine's 11, maybe take that step with her. Ask her to help you do a web search about Latinas in law. See let's find out who was your first woman lawyer on the bar in your state, those sorts of things. It'll be amazing how recent that distinction might have been.
Beautiful. And Kimberly?
So the two quick things that come to mind, one, I just want to underscore what Veronica said about knowing our history. We've actually been using the hashtag Know Your History on Twitter to encourage people to talk about the contributions of all women of color throughout feminism, throughout civil rights. So we're talking both about our struggles and the great work that we've done. So please join that conversation at Know Your History. You might learn something, and I'm sure you can share something. And the second thing is, encourage a young Latina to run for office. We hear that women have to hear 7 times or more someone tell them that they believe in them, that they can do it, that they can run for office. So be one of those 7. Tell a young Latina, you'd be great, you should run for office, and maybe you'll be the one that encourages her to do it.
Beautiful. And as we probably, as you have heard before, you have to ask a woman 7 times before she decides to actually run. So ask any young Latina 7 times, and hopefully they will do it. Because
just call her every day for a week.
Yeah, exactly. Until she runs, damn it.
Absolutely.
I'm going to give also my last words, my action call, and it will be to let's honor the women who fought for the right to vote in this country. Get out there. We have an election coming up in which the conventional wisdom is that Latinos don't get out and vote. But as women, I think we can make a huge impact if we, the ones that can vote, get out and vote for candidates that are women positive, that support women's rights. And I think that is a essential part of helping the fight for equality. If you don't have the representatives out there that are going to actually be proactive towards women, then you're not making any real progress. So with that, get out and vote, and then do whatever Kimberly and Veronica say, because they know what they're talking about. Okay? And I want to thank you both. I want to thank Kimberly from the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. You can see the website on the screen right now. It's latinainstitute.org. Thank you so much for being here, Kimberly.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to also thank Veronica, Viva la Feminista. And you can also see her website, hopefully, on the screen right now. Her website is vivalafeminista.com. And she is, any kind of issue that has to do with Latinas and feminism, she's talking about it. Also on Twitter. And I want to thank you both. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And thank you all who are watching. I hope that you continue to support these women. Also the women from NHLI, even though Aaron was not able to join us, but they're also at nhli.org. You're going to be able to watch the whole broadcast if you weren't able to watch it this time on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/user/Elian Ramos. Thank you so much, and I see you next week.
Thank you.